society, divisions over race, politics, social issues, and more run right through the body of Christ. And we quickly accuse each other by being swept away by ideologies and idolatries. It's really getting to be harder and harder to understand how any real Christian can hold viewpoints that are not our own and that are reflected by the other side. This webinar proposes a way to help us understand ourselves and our neighbor, resulting hopefully in greater humility and empathy. So to guide us in today's conversation, we're really glad to have Brandon O'Brien. He is the Director of Content Development and Distribution for Redeemer City to City, which is an organization that supports church planting in global cities. He's also the author or co-author of several books, including Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes, Not From Around Here, What Unites Us and What Divides Us, and How Can We Move Forward? And he lives in Phoenix, Arizona, with his wife, Amy, and their 2 children. And so we're really glad to have him today. We also have in this conversation, Dan White Jr., who's a full-time consultant and coach with the V3 movement. He coaches cohorts from around the country and has coached 200 faith communities over the last 5 years with compelling commitments of life-forming discipleship, boundary-crossing mission, locally rooted presence, and tight-knit community. He co-founded the Praxis Gathering, which is a yearly conference for innovation and immersion in discipleship. His most recent books are Love Over Fear, Facing Monsters, Befriending Enemies, and Healing Our Polarized World. And he's also written Subterranean and also co-authored the award-winning Church as Movement book. He's married to Tanya, dad to Daniel and Ari, and can be found enjoying conversations in his local neighborhood. And I am Lori Ruffin, founder of the COO team and operations manager with the V3 movement, and I reside in Richmond, Virginia. So we're really excited to dig into today's conversation. It's an important conversation given where we are, and so we're really glad that you are here. We want to highlight that this time is sponsored by the V3 Movement's Learning Cohort, which is a cohort that really focuses on building the best practices of being a church planter. How do we dig into crossing boundaries and locally rooted presence as we seek to invest in God's kingdom in our respective communities. And so we want to invite you, if you're interested in, if you're a planter, you're thinking about planting a church in your local community, we want to invite you to learn more about that. And you can do that through the V3 app. If you search on any app platform, whether you have Android or iPhone or even Google Play, if you look up the V3 movement, you can download an app that can explain to you more about that experience. And with that, I give you Brandon O'Brien. One more thing I'll say before I pass it over to him, there will be an opportunity to ask questions as Brandon drops these golden nuggets of truth and just helpful resources. Something may spark a thought in your mind, and we want to invite you to add any questions that come to your mind to the Q&A session, and we'll get to as many of those at the end of this time as possible. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lori, and for Dan and Tanya and everybody having me on here today. I'm really excited about this. And I'm excited about the question and answer time at the end. I'm sort of presenting here a new framework that I'm working on that makes sense to me and a couple of people I've shared it with, but lockdown restrictions being what they are, I haven't been able to talk to as many people live about it as I'd like. And it's a work in progress. So my take is that if it's like 50% right, but about 80% helpful, then I'll be pretty happy with that. And so I rely a lot on your feedback and questions. And so please do ask questions and engage in the second half of this. That'll be really, really helpful. Essentially, the question that I have been trying to answer for myself, I'm sure we've all had interactions like this in the last year. They've been around forever, but have intensified, especially in the last year, where I am frequently hearing friends of mine, family members of mine express that essentially they can't even comprehend how any real Christian could think, vote, believe, support, engage in, dot, dot, dot. It doesn't really matter what comes after the dots. The issue I think that has bothered me the most is what seems like a growing inability to even imagine that other believers can have different points of view or perspectives than I have, right? And the sort of growing confidence in sharing that disbelief publicly. It's very easy for us to see compromise, political compromise in other people, and very hard for us to see it in ourselves. And I think that's part of where that question comes from. But the question I've been asking myself is essentially what factors are shaping my faith in such a way that I can ask the question, how can any true Christian actually believe differently than I do, right? Like what can lead to that level of kind of not just disagreement, but kind of disbelief. And so essentially that's the question I'm trying to answer today. I think that there are 4 stories that we all kind of operate out of. And those 4 stories contribute to our view of things such that they can kind of help us understand why we reach the people who follow Jesus, adhere to the scriptures, and share basic theological convictions can still find themselves so far apart on such serious issues. So I think this may feel a little abstract at first, but I think that the dots start to kind of come together a little later. So hang with me, and I look forward to hearing your feedback. All right, so the first story that I think that everybody lives out of is a personal story. We all kind of operate out of a personal narrative. So it's funny, I don't know if this happens everywhere, but I feel like in the last few years living in New York, I had a lot of people ask me, so what's your story? And it became frequent enough that I had an answer, but it always struck me as sort of a strange question. It put a lot of pressure on me to tell a good story, maybe is what I was feeling. But when somebody asks that question, they aren't asking you for random data points. They're not asking you for just, stats off of your resume. They're really looking for a synthesis of your childhood experiences. Tell me about your family. What traumatic events or obstacles or limitations have you overcome? And they're looking for kind of inciting incidents, which I'll explain in a minute. But essentially, they're looking for you to describe a trajectory that explains how did you get to this point in your life and where are you going from here? And it assumes that you have a purpose and a direction and all that sort of thing. So it's not just the events of your life, it's the meaning that you make of your life, right? They're looking for an interpretation of your life story. I think the inciting incident here is interesting. I borrowed this from fiction writing or something, but that's the sort of the thing that happens in a story that gets the action happening. So my favorite childhood movie was The Goonies, and in The Goonies, at the beginning, they're just poorly behaved young teenagers, running crazy in town, and then they find a treasure map in the attic, and that's when they find that map, they have a purpose, they have a direction, the action of the story starts. And I think when somebody asks you, what's your story? It's a story that you live out of. I think many of us have that inciting incident, right? Where we weren't real sure what we were doing, but then we had some sort of experience outside of our comfort zone that changed the trajectory of our life. Or we experienced a trauma, the loss of a loved one or an accident, and that set us on a new career trajectory or something like that. And so when a person is asking about kind of where we're from or how we got here, I think that they're asking about this sort of personal story, and it has such profound influence on how we interpret the world around us that I think if we're having a hard time understanding where somebody is coming from in a political or theological or social issue, that a great question we can ask is, what's in this person's personal story, and not just the events, but how they interpret those events, the meaning that they make out of those events, that can help me understand and empathize with their point of view or their emotional reaction, their sense of commitment to this idea, right? And I think this is not a brand new idea, because for most of my life, we have talked about, the way you really empathize with somebody is that you try to think about things from their point of view, etc. But I think that we probably underestimate just how powerful this story is. I'm not an expert on this, so I'll just kind of mention it and then move on. But I have done a fair amount of reading in the last year on trauma and trauma care for a number of kind of personal reasons. And I think the power of your personal story becomes really clear when you start understanding how trauma works, because in a lot of ways, what trauma does is makes it impossible to create that clear story, right? That clear sense of trajectory and purpose. And very often that event becomes like the end of the story, and you kind of relive it over and over. And so I think you can see the breakdown in somebody's personal story and the meaning when it doesn't work. It's harder to see the significance of it when you can kind of take those things for granted. So the first story that we all live out of, not a huge surprise, is the personal story. I think there's a second one that's related and maybe gets a little less attention, but that's the corporate or communal story. Basically, the point here is that our personal stories do not take shape in a vacuum, that we all get a script and we get roles and we get a set and we get a wardrobe from the communities that shape us, right? So in a very real sense, the possibility of how I interpret the events of my life are determined up into a certain age, are determined very much by the communities that we grow up in. And so our personal stories are very deeply influenced by our communal or corporate stories. And those corporate stories can include things like geography, region, where you lived. I get the sense, I've lived in several regions in the US now, and I think like New York City has its own kind of self-consciousness about the city itself being a character in your life. Sometimes it's a villain, and sometimes it's a hero, but it's definitely applying pressure that shapes you. I grew up in the South, and the South has a very strong kind of corporate story about who we are, where we came from, what our values are, who are the heroes and villains in our story, etc. I think ethnicity is a strong sort of community shaper. And then social structures, and by this I mean partly class, but even things like, do you grow up knowing how to navigate education and business and other kinds of things that kind of give you a sense that you belong to a community of professionals, or you feel excluded from a community of professionals and that kind of thing. Again, these are not just data points, they're not just demographics, but they're meaning-making stories. The kind of the stories our communities tell that teach us how to interpret the events of our life, right? And so I think what's kind of significant about this is that two people with very similar life experiences may interpret those experiences very differently based on the communities that they are raised in, right? And so I think those meaning-making community stories are really powerful influences on us. Sorry, I lost my notes. Here we are. I think it can be hard to recognize the power of these stories for a couple of reasons. One is that one of our favorite stories in America to tell is about how an individual transcends the community that they grow up in, right? So I think a great recent example, the movie Hillbilly Elegy just came out, and the book, it's been a while since I read the book. The book itself feels less to me like an escape story, but the movie is sort of shaped as how I got out of this terrible situation by willpower, right? And making good choices and that sort of thing. And so I think we tell that story enough that we can have the impression that that's what most people do, is that our communal stories don't have that huge of effect on us because we can get out of them if we just try hard enough. And so I think it's one reason we don't always take that story into consideration. I think a second one is that for white Americans especially, we have a really hard time believing that we belong to either an ethnic or a sort of a subcultural group. So we think of ourselves almost entirely in individual terms, and our personal story is what we tell the most. And we kind of miss the fact that our communal corporate story has a pretty major impact on how we see the world. So A book that was mentioned in my introduction, the book Not From Around Here, really I kind of talked about these two stories, kind of personal story, how my personal experience exposed me to certain things, how growing up in a certain place and moving to different places kind of shaped the way I view things. And I didn't have that quite that terminology yet of that sort of personal narrative and community narrative, but that's really what that book is doing. It's kind of exploring the first two of these stories. And I think a great question to ask when we're having a hard time understanding or empathizing with someone is what community or communities does this person belong to and they're shaped by that gives them a stake in this discussion, right? So who do they belong to that has shaped their perception and gives them some sort of dog in the fight, for lack of a better word? All right, so these are the first two stories. These are probably not totally new because we're accustomed to empathizing with people based on kind of walking around in their shoes, which is that it's a great quote from To Kill a Mockingbird, kind of walk inside, put on someone else's skin, walk around. And we're, I think, increasingly comfortable talking to people as talking about people as members of communities that shape them. But I think there's a third story that became really prominent in 2020, towards the end of 2019, but definitely in 2020, and that is the national story. So our personal and communal stories are situated within or interwoven with another, and all of those are kind of part of a fabric that includes this national story. And our national story has to do with where did we come from, what were our founding values, what are the vices and virtues that we share that are related to those values, who are the heroes and villains, in the story, right? And so I think in America, there are kind of two dominant versions of this story. And they're illustrated really helpfully for somebody who is thinking about these things by two recent projects. One of them was the 1619 Project that kind of came out at the end of, or in 2019 to kind of rethink America's story. And the other was the 1776 Commission that may or may not be a project, but it's at least an announcement. And these are essentially shorthand summaries of these two major stories, right? And so the 1776 story is the one that we probably all grew up with in school, which is pilgrims fleeing religious liberty landed in America. They're warmly greeted by Native Americans and they have a big feast, and that's why we do Thanksgiving. And then we founded the greatest country in the world through hard work and a commitment to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And there was liberty and justice for all. And yeah, we've had our bumps, but but basically this is the story of our values, and where we've gone wrong, it's because we failed to live up to our values, but we're getting better with each generation. That's kind of the story. The other story that the 1619 Project tells, for example, is you can't tell that story about America without including slavery and land theft and exploitation of Black and brown bodies, right? Black and brown people. And so this great American economy that we built wasn't just hard work. It's also that we didn't pay the labor force that built it. We didn't pay for the land because we took it. And there's this sort of the second story of exploitation and manipulation, et cetera. And the reason these things are important is not because it's just curiosities of history. It's that our communal stories are really situated within this bigger national story, right? So like I grew up in the small town South in a religious context, and we really believed that over against the liberal elites on the two coasts, we were maintaining the values of the real America by the way we lived, and we were being true to the founders, and our faith was bound up in that, and our personal identity was bound up in that, and our community's identity was bound up in that. And I don't think we ever really thought critically about that story. We just repeated it. People have been questioning that story for a very long time, but especially since probably the 60s and 70s, is often questioning America's story is often associated with being Marxist, which is a problem right now because everything is associated with being Marxist, I think. But the issue is that once you start rethinking that communal story, that national story, it makes you ask questions about the other ones, right? And I think that's where this begins to be really concrete and practical, is that these things are so interwoven that it's hard to have a change of mind in one of those stories. It's hard to start viewing one of those stories differently without questioning all the other ones. And I think that's where that's sort of where we're headed. So I think if I'm having a hard time interacting with, I'm having a conversation with someone, I can't understand why they think what they think. A really good question to ask is, how does this person understand the national story and their place within it? Do they view themselves as a hero in the story? Do they see themselves as a villain? Do they think that they're upholding the values, or they're questioning the value? Like, what's this person's role in this big national story? If there's time, I want to get through the last of this first, and we can come back. A really interesting case study for this whole thing is comparing Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, who had very different personal stories, very different communities that form them, but very different understandings about what America is. And because they had very different understandings of what America was, it led them to very different conclusions about how to solve the problem, right? And it just kind of helps. It's an interesting case study, not least because there's a great book that does this, and I can just recommend it. You can read it, and it'll be fantastic. But so these are the sort of the first three: personal, the communal, and then the national story. And then the final story is the religious or philosophical story. This last one. And we're finally talking about our faith here, right, in a webinar about Christian things. So I think that the question here is, how does our religious story actually fit in with all the other ones? Is it the determining story, or is it not? Is it somehow related, but it's not the determining story? I think most of the time when apologists are talking about worldviews, for example, and talk about the Christian worldview, we talk in a way that says, if we just get that sort of dotted line circle worldview right, then all the other stories that we tell ourselves will sort of cascade down in sequence, right? So you get the religious story right first, and then the other ones fall into place. It's possible that that's how it should work, ideally. But in my experience, I think that it actually doesn't work that way. I think the way it actually works is our personal stories and our communal stories and our national stories, all of which we internalize and don't really talk about a whole lot explicitly, exert so much influence on our understanding of our faith that really that one is the most flexible and the other ones are the most fixed. So I think that when we are looking at somebody and asking, how is it that any true Christian can believe or vote or support or whatever, how is it that they believe that? Well, the answer to that question is because those other three stories are so powerful that they almost serve as filters, like at the eye doctor and that worst test in the world, it's like, is this one clear or this one clear? And by the time they're done, you've got like this stack of like all these different filters that you're looking at the screen through. And these different stories kind of work in that way, right? We're filtering everything we hear and read and see through those stories, including the Bible. So when we read a text, we're reading it through our personal story and our communal story and our national story. We don't even think about it. And so I think that these other three stories exert such influence that really one of those three is the one that determines our view of things, less so actually than our Christian faith. I think this is especially true for those of us who grow up in the faith, so that those four stories are interwoven together from the very beginning. This is where like it's always refreshing when I talk to somebody who becomes a Christian as an adult, because they have almost none of the other baggage, right? These things being sort of looped in together. I also think my wife pointed out as I was talking through this with her earlier this week, that people who convert from other religions and other parts of the world very often have to have a clean break with their personal or communal or national stories. And so their religious story can be all of that for them. But for most of us, especially in the US, I think it doesn't work that way. And so I think when we're trying to figure out where we're going wrong with each other, very often we focus on, we'll argue about a text from scripture, or we'll use a bunch of proof texts, but we're really not disagreeing about the Bible. Really what we're doing is we're viewing everything through such a different personal, communal, and national lens that's really where our breakdown is happening. So I think that there are a couple of takeaways here, and then I want to kind of bring this home to what this means for the church for a minute. But one is, I think it's really easy. It's much easier to see how someone else's stories are shaping their view of their Christian faith than it is to recognize how that's happening in us. So one thing I've sort of positioned this as how to be empathetic with somebody else, but I also think that each of these stories makes a great opportunity for self-reflection and kind of asking yourself questions to what key moments in my life, what experiences, etc., my kind of personal story shape the way I experience my faith, and how does that shade what I hear when I hear other Christians talking or when I read the scriptures, right? So I don't have that, but I'm working on that kind of like just a personal diagnostic to just kind of talk through some of these questions. So it's an opportunity for self-reflection. I also think that a lot of what we talk about as deconstructing our faith is actually begins as a conversion in one of these other stories. So I know a lot of people who started questioning the 1776 version of American history and really taking the 1619 version of American history seriously. And the problem was not that they became Marxists, right? So like some people would say, well, they swallowed a worldview and that's the problem. But then they're assuming that that fourth circle is the one that does all the work. I think really what happened is they have a conversion in this sort of national story, and then it makes them rethink, oh gosh, that means that the way I understood sort of my experience in my communities may not have been exactly right. And then that changes my own personal narrative. Maybe I didn't get all those scholarships because I'm so smart, but because I had access, and that makes things a little bit differently. Now I've got to rethink how I even tell my own story, right? And then their faith is a part of that, but I think very often the version of Christianity that so many of us come up with is not flexible or robust enough to absorb that line of questioning. And so then we try to run all these new thoughts through the faith and it just doesn't work. And it's not a problem with Christianity, it's a problem with Christianity as we know it, right? But most people don't have a broad enough exposure to Christian faith, either other traditions or other things to know that. It's just my faith doesn't work anymore, right? And so they experience it as a deconversion of faith, but I think it starts as a conversion of some sort from one of those other stories, right? So, all right, I feel like I'm rushing, but I'm trying to keep to the time. I'm doing okay. If our religious story is not the controlling story, then which one is? That's the question, right? And I think, I can't prove this in the time that we have right now, but I think in a year I could prove it, that based on what I'm reading, sociological stuff, anthropological stuff, etc., the greatest determiner or the greatest predictor of what you believe and how you behave is the community that you're a part of. So I think that of these four stories, that really and truly, the one that impacts us the most directly on a day-to-day level is our community story. I think that based on what I've read about how facts change people's minds, or why facts don't change people's minds and all that, is that the surest way to change somebody's mind is to change their relationships. And I think what that tells us is that that community story is the one that does the heavy lifting for us. And so another way to put that, I think, is that conversion is never just a change in your school of thought. It's always a change of community of practice. It's always a matter of joining a new people, right? And we know this. I think that's why we tell our teenage children, like, not to hang out with certain people because you're going to end up, acting like them and all that. We know that, but I think we don't realize just how profoundly our community shapes what's possible, what's real, etc. So I think, for example, when we moved to New York City about 4 years ago, we intentionally joined a multi-ethnic bilingual church. And being in that church under preaching from minority leaders in an urban setting, et cetera, this massive shift for us in community kind of reoriented my sense of like, well, what news sources do I think of as biased? And what readings of scripture now sound a little oversimple to me? And and none of it was necessarily an active decision to explore those things, but just by virtue of being in a new community, it opened up some possibilities that my previous communities did not make available, right? So we can maybe think about the ways this goes wrong. Somebody gets involved in a cult, or they, go down a wormhole on the internet, or they, whatever. But I think to think about this more positively, the New Testament really tells a story about a remarkable institution in which people are invited to leave their old communities and adopt a new communal story, right? It's actually really remarkable when you read Paul, and he asks Gentiles to accept Israel's history about Abraham and all those kinds of stuff as their own story. And he asks Jewish Christians to view the fate and future of Gentiles as part of their own purpose and trajectory in life. Is taking these two community stories that had been over the centuries pitted against each other as enemies. Jesus is saying, actually, I want you to absorb parts of each other's stories. And this kind of pulls us to the last slide, Tanya. But it's not just a matter of Jesus sort of redeeming any one community. It's that people are asked to sort of leave their primary communities and move toward Jesus, and in the process form a new one where they realize that their previous communities had really massive limitations, and that really we only begin to see the truth when we see it together through Jesus, right? And so in Ephesians 4, there's a really great, or Ephesians, all of Ephesians is kind of about this happening. But Ephesians 4 says, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. And from him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. And I think the image here, we often talk about spiritual gifts or calling or whatever, but really the image is Jewish Christians are not asked to become mature Christians on their own, and Gentile Christians are not asked to become mature Christians on their own. They're asked to come together to be a new community, a body of Christ, and together they're going to grow up into the head and become mature. And so Jesus sort of invites us out of these limiting community stories into a new one that shapes us. The challenge, of course, is that in the 21st century, most of us are joining churches, we're opting in to churches that already kind of share our view of the national story, and they kind of reinforce our communal story, and they celebrate our personal story. And so it takes real intentionality to be the kind of Christian community where you're questioning those things and recognizing the limitations of those things, and constantly reorienting towards Jesus, right? I think that means, though, that if you're a pastor of a community where people are like actively disagreeing with each other, you've got something really special happening, because you actually have a diversity of opinion, and that's something to work with, right? It has begun about the right way, but I think most of us are probably come up in pretty homogenous churches where people think roughly the same way. And so if you actually have dissensions and factions and disagreements, obviously the New Testament tells us you want to stop those. But I think where we are in history, the fact that you have those is actually good news. It's material. And it's a good way to point people towards saying, yeah, this is exactly what the early church was. They came in with all these different stories that shaped them. And the gospel challenged all of them, right? And I keep thinking, the gospel, Jesus says, in order really to embrace the gospel, you have to leave your father and mother and follow me, right? That's leaving your community story. It's changing your community story, right? And taking up your cross and following me is sort of sacrificing a personal story. And understanding that Jesus has not come to overthrow the Romans is really challenging the national story. And so there is a deep sense in which the gospel challenges all of those aspects and asks us to keep reorienting toward him and away from those things that kind of obscure our view of reality. And hopefully together, then we find the truth. So I'm a big believer increasingly all the time. I was trying to describe this to somebody the other day. Like, I am more confident in the truth of the gospel than I've ever been. I am more committed to the scriptures and their truth and reliability than I have ever been. And I am less confident in my own ability to perceive all of those things the right way than I have ever been. Right? And so I'm sort of in a place where I'm just hungry for diverse community and diverse opinions to help me see what I don't see, and to help me take off what needs to be taken off and embrace what needs to be embraced. And I really think that our churches are the only place in society that are really positioned to do that. We already have the groups, we already have the trust, we already have the rhythms of meeting and fellowship. We just have to really focus the purpose of those so that we can grow up in maturity together. So I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Brandon.
And we'll do what's next. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Can you hear me, Brandon?
Yeah, I got you.
Thank you. That tool that you just presented created a lot of kairoses for me. It's a really complex but simplified, which I think is beautiful when you can present
Thank you.
something as complex as that with such simplicity. It really, I'm already envisioning how it can be something that's accessible to people that I'm discipling. And so thanks for that work that you're doing to bring that down to the bottom shelf and make it understandable. The work you're doing around story, we can unpack this all day long, but story essentially is a very living, tangible, transcendent. It's a very flexible reality. And to enter into that kind of reality requires a level of curiosity, of interest, of inquisitiveness, like to actually lean forward to get interested in the movie and the plot. And so your tool is really about centering story. The hurdle is whether we're curious or not. This reminds me of Esther Meeks. I don't know if you're familiar with Esther Meeks' works, but she says that with technology and with ideologies and with our associations, we think we already know each other before we talk to each other. So I can size you up, Brandon. I can size up Lori and say, I already know everything I need to know about you. And so I'm wondering how you awaken or shake people up to actually be curious enough to explore stories that they find offensive or they have disbelief about, or they're disgusted with, or they're angry with. How do you get people to actually move into curiosity to story? Not that you have, I'm just asking that question from my own personal experience.
Absolutely. That's a great question. And I think you're exactly right. I think you're exactly right about the power of story here, and the mental image that keeps coming to my mind, because we have talked about the power of personal narrative, especially my whole life, right? So especially growing up in a very conservative church, we were always told with evangelism, they can't argue with your story, so just tell your story. And so there's always been this kind of, and then I think with the sort of McLaren emergent church kind of emphasis in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a kind of narrative push. But so I think we use that terminology, but I keep thinking, like, we talk about the power of stories a lot. But it's beginning to sound to me like if I'm holding a handgun and I say, hey, I've got this really powerful tool, watch what it can do, and then I use it to drive a nail, then everybody's like, yeah, you don't really understand how powerful that tool is, right? And I think that's what I've kind of arrived at with stories, is that we often talk about the conscious ones that we're sort of like telling the stories. I don't think we always realize how shaped we are by the unconscious ones that we have not yet articulated, right? And that we're really acting out a script, and that the world, that different communities and ideologies keep handing us scripts to kind of follow and live out. And so I think that's a little tangential, but I think that's kind of just seeing that that dynamic at work, I think, is helpful. And I think that's one way with certain personality types, especially personality types. I have a number of these in my family who are conspiracy theorists and other kinds of things that, like, well, the world, they want you to think such and such. And I think everybody wants you to think such and such. Everyone's giving you a script. And so the issue is not that you either don't have one or you get duped into having one, you have one. And so really, if you are so concerned about the government controlling your mind, let's do a little bit of excavation about what scripts you're acting out of, right? So I think that some people you can kind of get that way. I think, again, as far as I can tell, the greatest predictor of change, and even, I mean, kind of increased curiosity, is relationship. And so I think for us, I have 2 adopted children. They are ethnically different from us, and we only have 2. They're both adopted. And I think for a number of people in our family, it was their relationships with their grandchildren, nieces, nephews, cousins, etc., that was enough to make them curious about some of these conversations, right? Now, I don't think that adopted children should bear the burden of having to play that role, right? That's not their job. But that's an example of a relationship that you don't have to go seek out, that can nevertheless push you across that line to say, I got to start asking some different questions, or I got to start taking this viewpoint seriously. And so I think anything that we can do to develop relationships across some kind of difference, whether it's socioeconomic or religious or ethnic or a gender or whatever, I think that those things, they don't necessarily spur you on to that kind of curiosity, but I don't know how you get to that level of curiosity without it. You really have to have those relationships can be that kind of inciting incident, right? That, like, I had this conversation with this guy. It's even as simple as, like, if you've never had this conversation with a Black man and you just ask them about their experience driving, and you know that this is a person who does not normally lie to me about things, and that they don't normally blow things out of proportion, and they tell me that they've been pulled over 5 times in their own neighborhood, like, if that doesn't get you across the line to asking questions, then I don't know that anything else will, right? It just starts with that kind of a relational connection that challenges one of your stories and makes you kind of go, I think the way I have interpreted that maybe is wrong, and this gives me something else to chew on. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
No, that's really helpful. It's really helpful. It's obvious, right? But I think that with the turn of the century, relationship has actually taken a back seat when it comes to the way that we engage each other. And so I think it's the most powerful stimulus for possible transformation, is to recover. Back to just sharing Esther Meeks again, and her work has been so powerful for me. She says there's no transformation without interpersonal presence. We want to sidestep that. We want to skip around it. We want to fast track to changing someone's mind. But we were built for incarnation. We were made and designed for this. And so the more we try to shortcut around it, the more we're going to have antagonism, anger, dissension, division, misunderstanding, and ultimately no change.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. And so if that's actually the desire to change, see transformation in a harmful view that is hurting another, we have to walk over the bridge of relationship. So anyhow, that's really helpful.
Well, and I think it's helpful to keep 2 things in mind. And one is that all of society works against those kinds of relationships.
Yeah.
And so I think that, if I'm really interested in things like the sort of zip code bubbles where in the last election, they're talking about the fact that like most people live next door to people who vote like them. And then when you're on social media, most people that you interact with are, even if they live across the country, you share affinity and probably political views and probably religious views, etc. So then it gives you the idea that people all over the country think this way, when really it's just another kind of zip code like yours, right? Where they're homogenous. And then there's the sort of filter bubbles of, even when I do a Google search, there are algorithms that are helping to present to me things that they think I want based on my so I never have. And then, we're in a new town looking for schools, and I think, gosh, it's hard to find a diverse school, even in diverse zip codes, because of the way, the boundaries are drawn for districts and whatever else. And I think everything works against it. You have to try to do it. You have to try to build those bridges. And I think it's helpful to see that, and it's helpful to recognize that for some of us, part of our communal story is that most of the people out there are trying to dilute your Christian worldview, and they're trying to brainwash your children. I'm exaggerating here a little bit, but through teaching evolution in schools and through policies that destroy the family and so part of our story is that any engagement with someone different from me is dangerous because they're trying to deconvert me or something.
Yeah.
And so you have to even recognize that like secular society is sort of organized to put like people by like people, right? And your kids look the same and your houses are worth about the same. Like everything's kind of near you is the same. But even our sort of community stories work against us because we've been scripted to view people who are different as a threat. And so those are two really powerful forces that you have to push against. And it's not easy, but I think it's helpful to name them, to kind of identify.
I would definitely say so, Brandon. It's like equally encouraging to know that there are these series of stories that we can unpack. But then it's also a little challenging when we think about how homogenous our circles are and how unnatural or it feels to be in diverse enough and contrasting spaces to where some of that curiosity can be sparked. One of our attendees asked the question, what kinds of questions can we ask in conversation with someone who obviously sees things quite differently than we do? Or what kinds of questions can we even ask ourselves when we meet someone whom we know are going to rub us the wrong way with their views?
Yeah, those are both great questions. I have learned that partly in experience and partly I like to read things and then test it out on people. So I hope they don't feel like guinea pigs, but sometimes, sometimes they are. So I think actually, we like to think we're rational beings, but really we're feeling beings, right? And so I have almost stopped asking people about what do you think about this thing that's happening in the news, and have asked them, how do you feel about this thing that's happening in the news? And I find that that's a much more, first of all, it kind of knocks people off balance because I think that maybe don't even think of it that way. But I think if you can follow a feeling track with somebody, that helps. Like when you see somebody that's protesting in the street against something, how does that make you feel? And why does it make you feel that thing instead of maybe this other thing? And I think kind of following the feeling track is more useful than the give me your opinion about such and such. Partly because odds are they have not connected, because most of us don't, our opinion to a feeling. So that you're helping them kind of get down to that. But very often the opinions that all of us have are just, it's a script that we picked up in our community or on social media and that we repeat. And so you don't ever get anywhere. You're just sort of passing hashtags to each other, right? But you ask about the feelings, you get a little bit deeper. And I think a similar question when you meet with somebody that rubs you the wrong way, because I like most people, and then there are these handful of people, and I can't always figure out why, that I think we're just going to conflict, and I don't understand why. And so sometimes just asking myself, like, why does this person threaten me? Does this person do I feel shame? Do I feel like, again, kind of turning the feeling question on myself, like, what is it? Why do I have this reaction with this person? And if I can get it past the rational, like, well, because they think this and I think that, well, that doesn't matter. I have lots of friends that think differently than me.
Yeah.
That's not the problem. I had a friend, a mentor, professor. I spent a semester overseas in college, and he told me that one of the things I should anticipate with culture shock is that it's never the things that are really different that bother you. It's the things that are almost the same, but not quite. And I experienced that with hamburgers in the UK. I never had a good hamburger in the UK, but I kept trying because I thought, I just really want a hamburger. Like, I'm an American abroad, I need a hamburger. And I was always so annoyed that it was close, but not quite right. And I find that in relationships, often the people that frustrate me the most are the people where it's like, we're close. It's not the people I disagree with the most. It's the people that I feel like we ought to agree and we don't, or we agree on so many other things and then can't see eye to eye on this. And that sometimes I have found that it's not the two people on the ends of the poles who have the hardest time. It's the people that are closer to each other on the spectrum that have a harder time getting past that block. And so.
Yeah. Brandon, one of the things that's really intriguing about what you're saying is this is partly the work of self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
How do we increase self-awareness when many of us, to your point, have not really thought about our stories?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And even have merged some of the stories, like you mentioned, that the tendency of someone who's been a Christian kind of all their lives probably have matched their collective story with the national story and potentially their personal story, where it's all kind of fused together and it's hard to tease it apart. What do you recommend for just even increasing awareness that there is a story to be unteased?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if, so I think a spiritual practice that I like, and this is, I include a version of this in, not from around here, I actually find it sort of endlessly flexible, but is the Ignatian practice of examine, the daily examine. And the short version is basically you get quiet before God, you reflect on your day, and then you ask the Spirit to sort of highlight an event from the day that requires some excavation, right? And so it's things like, this thing happened. Why did I react the way I reacted when this thing happened? And you sort of bring that into prayerful conversation with the Spirit. And then you essentially say, thanks, and pray for a better day tomorrow, and on you go, right? So it's not wallowing or whatever. But I actually it's free. You can do it this afternoon, but it begins to kind of tune you to being aware of dynamics that you often miss. And so it's not like, I'm mad because that person cut me off. It's like, but why am I mad that the person cut me off? I'm driving, that happens. Why did it make me angry? It forces you to kind of ask why questions of yourself. I think that, I think everyone should be seeing a coach or a spiritual director or a counselor or something. And very often what they will do is talk about those first two stories, right? You're unpacking some personal stuff, and a good counselor, therapist will help you say, why do you interpret, they're kind of helping you identify the stories that you live out of, whether they're true or false doesn't really matter because you're living out of them, right? Or helping you see it truthfully. But then they'll maybe connect that to your community. You pick that up in your community, or they don't necessarily help you get to the other two. I think there's a whole lot of conversation happening right now about the national story, and people just find it they don't know where to connect it in. And so I think you could probably pick any resource that's out there right now on that topic. And I think the work that I haven't seen other people doing is connecting it to your community and personal stories. So like, when I read this account of American history, at one level, as Americans, we'll say things like, it shouldn't matter to me what the people did in 1619. I wasn't responsible for that. But then at the same moment, you imply that all of our values are corrupt from the beginning. And people are like, well, hang on a second, that's my heritage you're talking about. So like, we can't quite decide whether we're just total individualists or if our heritage really matters. But that emotional reaction then I think is something to say, aha, why am I, that's maybe then the prayer of examine, right? Read Jamar Tisby's book. And then when you have an emotional reaction, use the prayer of examine and say, why, what is this challenge? What does it threaten? What do I stand to lose if this is true? You know, what do I stand to gain if it's true? You know, it's just kind of helping yourself process. And I think what's important about this framework, and actually I drew it on the board, I don't know if you can, is I think if I had to do it again, let's see if I can move it. I kind of redid them almost as like threads in a fabric, right? It's not so much concentric circles that like they all are based on one another, it's that they're interwoven. And when you start to pull a thread, it bunches in other places and things start to come loose and you got to put them back together. And so I think that even something like that examine in any part, you know, any one of those stories can be really helpful. So like the ex-evangelical movement is kind of a deconversion from a community story, right? Yes. Deconversion from purity culture, deconversion. So then even sitting in that and saying, you know, why do I react this way? Why do I, et cetera, I think can help show the connections between those stories. I think that's what's so powerful. It's not just them individually, but how they connect. So
we've got about 60 seconds left, Brandon. So okay. I want you to condense your awesome thinking into 60 seconds, which is a tall task.
Yeah.
So one question is, should we focus on what we have in common and not be distracted by what separates us?
You know what? I think if that thing that we have, in terms of just getting a job done, right? Like if we've all got to build a fence together, let's not worry about the things that we disagree about. Let's keep focused on the task at hand. But I think if we never bring to the front the things that are different that we disagree about, none of us will ever grow. I think the only way we ever grow is if we pay attention to the disagreements and the differences. And so I would think in a church setting, for example, that I would rather be part of a church that is actively talking about the things that we disagree about so that we can grow closer together and we can mature, rather than just saying, you know what, let's just talk about Jesus. We all agree about Jesus and focus on the gospel. And then those other things don't go away. They just sort of fester. And so then instead of growing toward one another, we grow apart. And so I think that for maturity's sake, we have to pull those things out and deal with them. And it has to be done in the right way again, right? But I think that we have to keep reminding ourselves about what we share in common, but we can't then ignore the things that are different. We have to bring those things out in a careful way and deal with them.
Yes, that's amazing. A great response. And so it's like growth is on the line, but then even we may not actually have agreement on the scope of what we actually need to focus on if we don't actually unpack our stories.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Because, you know, there are many different threads in the scripture, different topics, different words, different books, different writers, different things that God is concerned about. And so thank you so much for offering this framework for us today. We just really appreciate that. And want to tell everybody, if you're on this webinar, there are opportunities and spaces where you can wrestle with these and other ideas. We have a learning cohort. So this session is sponsored by V3 Movement's Learning Cohort, which is an 8-month experience for people who are church planters. It's a training, a practical, hands-on training around grounded missional practices. And so one of the things that we can think about with what Brandon shared, and what are the places where we can actually wrestle with such ideas, and this is one of them. So we want to invite you to consider applying to participate. You can learn more about it on the V3 Movement app, which you can get from the Apple Store, the Android, Google Store, and or Amazon. So thanks.